He was blind, she was a nobody, but together they took down a town built on lies. In a quiet town that seemed to hold its breath in the midday sun, there lived two very different people. To the outside world they were strangers, unremarkable, almost invisible. But fate was about to change that forever. He was a man who had never seen the world in the way others did. Born blind, he had known the world only through his other senses, through the feel of the rough bark on a tree, the sound of birds singing in the morning, and the wind brushing against his face. His name was Samuel, and despite his blindness, he had never let it define him. People in the town often referred to him as the blind man, with a tone that suggested sympathy, perhaps pity. He didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it. He didn't need the world to pity him, and he didn't want to be seen as a hero. But Samuel had one thing that others didn't see, a mind that was sharp and a heart full of quiet determination. Samuel lived alone in a small cottage on the edge of the town. People spoke about him, of course. Whispers of how he managed on his own. Some said he was a man with a secret. Others said he was simply too proud to accept help. But to Samuel, it didn't matter what anyone thought. He had learned to rely on his own instincts, to trust his inner world more than the external one. His life was peaceful, simple, and solitary, until the day she walked into it. Her name was Clara. To most, she was just another face in the crowd. She had no family in the town, no connections to the people who ran things. Clara was a woman of modest means, working as a waitress at the local diner. She didn't stand out in any particular way. In fact, people often overlooked her, treating her as invisible as the air. Her past was a series of quiet moments, moving through life without making a ripple.
But Clara wasn't just any woman.
She was strong, in a way most didn't realize. Though she was unassuming, her heart held a fire that burned with a quiet passion for justice. She believed in fairness, in right and wrong, and she would fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Clara's life wasn't easy. She worked long hours, scraping by, always just getting by. There was no room for dreams in her life, only the constant rhythm of survival. But she had a deep sense of wanting something more, a longing for something better, something true. Her world felt small, but there was a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was something bigger waiting for her. One day, their worlds collided. Clara was walking down the street after a long shift, tired but with a small smile on her face from a kind word given to her by a regular customer. As she passed the corner of the street near the park, she heard the soft tapping of a cane against the sidewalk. It was a familiar sound, the tap-tap-tap of Samuel making his way through the street. Normally, Clara would have passed by without a thought, but that day, something made her stop. Maybe it was the rhythm of his steps or the way he seemed to move with such calm certainty despite his blindness. Something inside her urged her to speak. "Excuse me," she said softly but firmly.
Samuel paused, his head turning slightly toward the sound of her voice.
His face was hidden in shadow, but Clara could see the outline of his figure, standing tall and confident despite the darkness that surrounded him. "Yes," Samuel's voice was steady, deep. There was no hint of surprise, as though he had been waiting for her to speak. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure why she had stopped. But then she simply asked, "Can I help you find your way?" Samuel smiled, a smile that she couldn't see but could feel in the warmth of his voice. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I'm used to the path." It was then that Clara noticed something. There was a sense of peace in Samuel that she couldn't quite place. It was as if the world around him didn't matter, as if he was in complete harmony with his surroundings. Bust. He glances around in desperate. Clara felt an urge to keep talking. You know, I've always wondered how you manage, walking around here all the time. I've learned to listen, Samuel replied, his voice never faltering. The world speaks in its own way. You just need to learn how to hear it. There was something about his words that made Clara pause. Most people would have seen Samuel as a victim of circumstance, someone to pity for his blindness.
But here was a man who didn't ask for pity. He didn't need it.
And that made Clara respect him in a way she hadn't respected anyone in a long time. Would you like to sit for a while, she asked, not sure why she felt compelled to offer. To her surprise, Samuel agreed. They sat together on the bench in the park, talking for hours as the sun set behind them. Samuel shared stories of his childhood, of how he had learned to navigate the world with his other senses, and how he found beauty in things most people overlooked. Clara, in turn, told him about her struggles, how she had come to the town in search of a new beginning, only to find that life had been just as hard as before. They didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives, forever. Break. Over the following weeks, they met regularly. Samuel began teaching Clara how to use her own senses in ways she hadn't thought possible. He showed her how to listen to the rhythm of the world, the way a leaf fluttered on a tree or how the ground felt underfoot when someone was nearby. Clara, in turn, shared her dreams with him, the dreams she had kept hidden for so long. They didn't just talk, they listened to each other. They understood each other in a way that no one else had ever truly done. But as they grew closer, they started to notice something else, a growing unease in the town. There were whispers of corruption, of powerful people using the town's wealth for their own gain, leaving the less fortunate to suffer. Raven had heard rumors for months, but had never thought much of them. But as Samuel's insights began to open her eyes, she started to see the cracks in the town's perfect facade. The lies that everyone else turned a blind eye to were suddenly glaring. And together, Samuel and Clara began to realize that something needed to be done. It wasn't long before they found themselves in the center of a battle they never expected. Samuel, the blind man, and Clara, the nobody, together. They were about to take on a system that had been built on lies.
And neither of them was prepared for the challenges ahead. But one thing was certain. Neither of them would back down.
The days following their initial meeting brought Samuel and Clara closer together. What had begun as casual conversation on a park bench had blossomed into a deep and meaningful friendship. Clara often found herself marveling at how much she learned from Samuel. His ability to see the world through his heightened senses fascinated her. In many ways, Samuel's world was more vivid than her own, though she had the use of her eyes. His world was full of sounds, smells, textures, and rhythms that spoke volumes, and Clara found herself paying more attention to the small details she'd never noticed before. One day, as they sat on their usual bench in the park, Samuel said something that struck Clara deeply. "The world isn't as it seems, you know," he said quietly. "There are layers to everything. People just don't look closely enough to see them." Clara frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" she asked. Samuel smiled, though Clara couldn't see it. "Take the town, for example. It looks peaceful, doesn't it? Everyone going about their day, smiling, chatting. It all seems so perfect, but if you listen closely, you can hear the cracks."
You can feel the tension in the air, even if you can't always explain it. Clara hadn't thought about the town that way before.
The streets were always bustling with activity, the houses well kept, and the local businesses thrived. People smiled as they passed one another, waving hello to friends and neighbors. It was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and there was a sense of community, a feeling of unity. But now that Samuel mentioned it, Clara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. She nodded slowly.
I've heard whispers, she confessed.
Nothing specific, just rumors. People talk about the town's leaders, the ones running everything. Some say they're doing things that aren't quite right. But who knows? People like to gossip. Samuel's brow furrowed.
There's more truth in those whispers than anyone realizes. I've been listening to the wind, Clara.
And the wind is telling me that this town isn't built on the foundations everyone believes it is.
People are getting hurt, but no one wants to admit it.
Not openly. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She felt a sudden wave of unease wash over her.
Could Samuel be right?
Was there something hidden beneath the surface of her small, peaceful town? Why doesn't anyone speak up? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's face grew serious. People are afraid. They don't want to rock the boat. They've been told to keep their heads down, to stay quiet. And they listen. The ones in charge have made sure of that. Clara leaned forward, a new sense of determination growing inside her. So, what do we do? How do we find out the truth? Samuel paused for a moment, listening to the soft rustle of leaves in the trees. But when he spoke again, his voice was calm but firm.
We start by listening, just like we always do.
Bus. We need to pay attention to the things others overlook. There's always a clue, always a hint.
But we'll have to dig deeper. We'll have to be careful.
Clara's mind raced. Samuel had already shown her how to pay attention to things she had never noticed before. The way the air felt, the sounds of footsteps, the subtle vibrations in the ground beneath their feet. It was all connected in a way that most people missed. And now, together, they were going to uncover the truth about their town. Narration.
Over the following weeks, they began their investigation. Clara started asking more questions, casually at first.
The star-she'd strike up conversations with people at the diner, the market, or the park, pretending to be interested in the small talk of everyday life. She asked about the local government, the businesses in the area, and the town's history. And as she listened, a disturbing picture began to form. There were inconsistencies, small things that didn't add up. People who had once been successful had suddenly disappeared, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned shops. There were rumors of large sums of money changing hands under the table, of businesses being bought and sold under mysterious circumstances. And then, there were the people, the ones who had fallen through the cracks, the ones whose stories didn't fit the town's rosy picture. It wasn't just whispers anymore. Clara was beginning to see the cracks for herself, but it wasn't enough to simply see the signs. She needed more. She needed evidence. One afternoon, Samuel led Clara down a narrow alley behind one of the town's oldest buildings. The street was quiet, and the sounds of the town seemed to fade into the background. Samuel's cane tapped against the ground as they walked, the sound echoing through the empty space. "I've been listening to this alley for years," Samuel said quietly. "There's a lot going on behind closed doors here, Clara, but no one talks about it. If we're going to find something, it's here." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. What were they about to uncover? They came to a small door at the back of the building. It was locked, but Samuel had told Clara to expect this. With a few quick movements, he pulled out a small set of tools from his bag. Clara stood back, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what Samuel was about to do, but she trusted him. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. Samuel smiled, though Clara couldn't see it. "I've been here before," he said, But there's more inside than I can sense alone. It's your turn to look, Clara Bright. Clara stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was filled with old papers, stacks of ledgers, and dusty filing cabinets. She had no idea what she was looking for, but the weight of the situation pressed down on her. They were about to dive deeper into something dangerous, something that could change everything. As Clara began to sift through the papers, her hands trembled. The documents were filled with names, dates, and figures, money flowing between accounts, large sums being transferred from one business to another. But it was the name on one particular document that made Clara's heart stop. She recognized it immediately. It was the name of one of the town's most respected leaders, the same leader who had been mentioned in all the rumors she had heard. The document was a receipt. A large payment had been made, but the details were vague. No explanation, no justification. Just a sum of money. Breath. Clara's mind raced. This was it. This was the proof they needed. She turned to Samuel, her face pale. This is it. We found something. Samuel nodded. Now we need to figure out what it means. They left the building quietly, the papers hidden carefully in Samuel's bag. The evidence they had found was damning, but it wasn't enough. They needed to uncover the full extent of the corruption. They needed to find out how deep the lies ran and who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. As Clara walked alongside Samuel, the weight of their discovery pressed down on her. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, and the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. But one thing was clear. They were no longer just two ordinary people in a quiet town. They were now part of something much bigger, something that could bring the town's dark secrets into the light. As the days passed, the discovery Clara and Samuel had made began to feel heavier on their shoulders. What they had uncovered, the receipt with the leader's name, the money trail, and the hints of corruption, was just the tip of the iceberg. It was enough to know that something was terribly wrong with the way the town was being run, but it wasn't enough to bring about any real change. They needed to uncover more. Breaths. They needed more evidence. But more than that, they needed to find out just how deep the lies had gone. The more they dug, the more unsettling things became. Clara spent hours going over the papers Samuel had collected. G was meticulous, studying every document, comparing the dates, the names, the numbers. And each time the story grew darker. There were mentions of shady deals with landowners, promises made under the table to certain influential people, and businesses that seemed to thrive without any clear reason. The patterns were unmistakable. Money flowing from the poor to the rich, from the helpless to the powerful. Samuel, despite his blindness, had a remarkable sense of the town's pulse, his ability to listen to the faintest sounds and pick up on things others might miss, allowed him to observe things in ways most people couldn't. He began to notice small, almost imperceptible changes in the town's atmosphere. The way the air seemed to thicken when certain names were mentioned. The way people would change the subject or avoid eye contact when certain topics came up. First, there was an air of fear in the town. A silence that spoke volumes. It was as if everyone knew something was wrong, but was too afraid to say anything. One afternoon, as they sat in the park, Clara turned to Samuel with a furrowed brow. "I don't get it," she said. "How can people live like this? How can they let things get this bad?" Samuel leaned back slightly, listening to the sounds of the town around them. "Fear is a powerful thing," he said quietly. "People are afraid of losing what little they have, of being crushed by those in power. So, they turn a blind eye to the truth. They pretend they don't see the injustice, the corruption, because acknowledging it would mean standing up to it. And standing up to it could cost them everything. She had known that fear played a big role in the town's silence, but hearing Samuel put it into words made it all the more real. It made her feel even more determined to do something, to make sure that the truth came out. But the problem was, how could they fight against an entire system built on lies? They couldn't do it alone. They needed allies, but who could they trust? Who could they turn to in a town where everyone seemed to be hiding something? They began to quietly test the waters, reaching out to people they thought might be willing to help. It wasn't easy. Most people either looked the other way or told them to mind their own business. But Clara was persistent. She began to find people who weren't so quick to dismiss what was happening. There was Thomas, a former worker at one of the local factories, who had been fired after speaking out about unsafe conditions. There was Evelyn, a woman whose husband had disappeared under mysterious circumstances after he started asking questions about the town's leaders.
And there was Marcus, a retired sheriff who had seen firsthand how the town's power brokers manipulated the law to suit their needs. Together they formed a small but determined group, all with one goal in mind, to expose the truth and bring justice to the town.
But they all knew that this wasn't going to be easy.
The town was controlled by a few powerful people, and they had the resources to crush anyone who stood in their way.
The more they learned, the more they realized just how deeply the corruption ran. The mayor, the town council members, and the local businessmen who seemed so respectable on the surface, they were all part of a system that had been exploiting the townspeople for years. They used their positions to control the land, the jobs, the housing, and even the police force. They had rigged the system so that only a select few could benefit, while everyone else was left to struggle. Clara's heart sank as she uncovered more details about the ways the town's leaders had manipulated the town's economy. Local farmers were being driven out of business by overpriced land leases, while the mayor and his associates bought up land at a fraction of the price. Small businesses were being forced to close as the big corporations took over. And the town's workers, those who had been loyal to the system for years, were now finding themselves out of work, their livelihoods taken from them by the very people they had trusted. But the most shocking discovery came when Clara and Samuel uncovered evidence of an illegal deal between the town's leaders and a powerful corporation. The deal involved the construction of a new development on the outskirts of town, one that would displace dozens of families and destroy a community that had been around for generations.
The corporation had bribed the mayor to push the project through, bypassing environmental regulations and ignoring the needs of the people who would be most affected by it.
Clara stared at the papers in disbelief.
This is unbelievable, she whispered. They're going to tear down everything people have worked for, all for a profit.
And no one will even know how it happened. Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm.
That's why we have to tell them, Clara. We can't let them do this.
As the weeks passed, their small group grew more determined. They knew they had to act quickly before the town's leaders could finalize the deal with the corporation.
But the more they tried to gather evidence and build their case, the more dangerous the situation became. People were starting to notice them, starting to ask questions. And the town's power brokers weren't the type of people to let anyone get in their way. One night, as Clara was returning home from a meeting with Marcus, she was stopped by a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with a stern expression and a sharp look in his eyes. "You've been asking too many questions, miss," he said, his voice low and threatening.
People like you don't belong here. You should be careful who you talk to.
Desk. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know who this man was, but she had a feeling he was tied to the people she and Samuel were trying to expose. She stood her ground, refusing to back down.
"I'm not afraid of you," she said,
her voice steady despite the fear rising inside her. Precarious. The man's eyes narrowed. You should be.
He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows.
Clara stood there for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but there was no turning back now. She had come too far. And Samuel had come too far to give up now. They had to expose the truth, no matter what it cost. And so the fight continued. Clara and Samuel, along with their small group of allies, pressed forward, gathering more evidence, reaching out to more people, and slowly building a case that would expose the lies that had held their town captive for so long. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. They knew they were risking everything. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to stop until the truth was revealed. The town that had once seemed so peaceful, so perfect, was now a battleground. And Clara and Samuel were determined to take it down, piece by piece. Clara could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on her with each passing day. The documents they had found, the people they had spoken to, the secrets they had uncovered. Everything was pointing to one undeniable truth. The town had been built on lies, and now the people in power would do anything to protect their interests. But Clara wasn't the kind of person who backed down. Not anymore. She had a taste for justice now, and she wasn't about to let fear or threats stand in her way. Samuel, too, had grown more determined with each new discovery. Though he couldn't see the physical world, his mind had a way of navigating through the murky waters of deception. His sharp intuition had led them to key pieces of evidence, and his ability to listen to what others overlooked had brought them closer to understanding just how deep the corruption ran. They had uncovered so much already, but there was still so much more to uncover. The more they discovered, the more they realized just how far the deception spread. Their small group of allies had grown, but so had the risk. Each day more eyes were on them, more whispers behind their backs, more people afraid to speak out for fear of retribution. Clara had known that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy, but now the consequences of their actions felt much more real. They were up against an entire system built on lies and corruption, and the people in power had no intention of letting go without a fight. One evening, Clara and Samuel were walking through the town square discussing their next move. The town was quiet as usual, the evening light casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. The distant hum of the evening crowd could be heard in the background. Samuel's cane tapped rhythmically on the pavement as they walked side by side. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Clara asked, her voice soft. Samuel paused for a moment, tilting his head slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. "I think about it all the time," he said quietly. "But I also know that the real fight is just beginning. The people in charge aren't going to let us take them down without a fight. They'll do everything they can to stop us." Clara nodded, her hands clenched into fists.
I know, but I can't just sit back and let them destroy everything.
The people here, they deserve better. They deserve to know the truth.
Samuel smiled, though Clara couldn't see it. "You're right."
They do.
And we're going to make sure they get it.
It wasn't long before Clara and Samuel discovered just how dangerous their mission had become. Late one night, as Clara was returning home from a meeting with their allies, she was followed. She could feel someone watching her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she quickened her pace. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing, just the dim streetlights flickering in the darkness. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind her. The footsteps were too deliberate, too close. When she reached her front door, she quickly unlocked it, pushing it open and stepping inside. But before she could close it, a voice came from the shadows. Don't think you can hide, Clara? Clara froze. It was a man's voice, cold and menacing. She knew immediately that he wasn't someone she wanted to meet. I know what you've been doing, the man continued, stepping out of the shadows and into the light. He was tall, with a hard look in his eyes. You're playing a dangerous game. Clara's heart raced, but she refused to show fear.
I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice steady. The man smirked, stepping closer.
You should be. You've been asking too many questions, Clara. People like you don't belong in a town like this. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't let this man intimidate her. I belong here just as much as anyone else, she said firmly. And I'm not going to stop until the truth comes out. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. You're making a big mistake, he said, his voice low. You're digging in places you shouldn't. If you don't stop, you'll regret it. Before Clara could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her standing in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. The encounter had shaken her, but it also solidified her resolve. Breath. She wasn't going to let fear stop her now. She had come too far to back down. The next day, Clara met with Samuel, telling him about the man who had followed her. Samuel listened intently, his face thoughtful. This is what we've been preparing for, he said quietly. The people in power won't go down without a fight. They'll use every trick in the book to stop us, but we can't back down now. Clara nodded. We won't. Over the next few weeks, their group of allies continued to gather evidence. They dug deeper into the town's records, uncovered more illegal deals, and found more people who were willing to speak out against the corruption. Each new piece of information brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to danger. The stakes had never been higher. And then the unthinkable happened. One evening, as Clara was going over some documents in her small apartment, she received a call. It was from Marcus, one of their allies. Clara! Marcus's voice was urgent. You need to get to the old warehouse now. Something's going down. Without wasting a moment, Clara grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. Her heart raced as she made her way to the warehouse, a sense of dread settling in her stomach. What was happening? What had Marcus found? When she arrived, she found the warehouse dark, except for a few dim lights flickering in the distance. She could hear muffled voices coming from inside. Cautiously, she stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. Samuel was already there, waiting for her. His cane tapped softly against the floor as he moved toward her. What's going on? Clara asked, her voice tight with worry. I don't know, Samuel replied, his voice steady but filled with concern. But I have a feeling it's bad. We need to be careful. They approached the door cautiously, listening for any sign of what was happening inside. The voices grew louder and Clara's stomach churned. She could hear the unmistakable sound of papers being shuffled, voices rising in anger. There was something important happening inside that warehouse, something they needed to witness. With a deep breath, Clara pushed the door open and the two of them stepped inside. What they saw made Clara's heart drop into her stomach. A group of men were gathered around a table, papers spread out before them. Among them was the town's mayor, a man whose face she had seen countless times on posters and in meetings. But now, in the dim light, he looked different, more sinister. We can't let them find out, the mayor was saying. We've got too much to lose. The deal with the corporation is already in motion.
If they find out about the land deals, we're finished.
This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. The mayor was talking about the illegal deal with the corporation, the very thing they had been trying to expose. "We have to cover our tracks," one of the men said. "If anyone gets too close, we eliminate them." Clara's blood ran cold. This was no longer just about exposing corruption. This was about survival. She and Samuel were now in more danger than ever before. But Clara's resolve only grew stronger. They couldn't stop now. Desp. As they slipped out of the warehouse, Clara's heart raced with a mix of fear and determination. They had what they needed. The truth was out there, and now more than ever, they had to make sure it came to light. The truth was finally in their hands, and with it, Clara and Samuel knew that the stakes had never been higher. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together, the corruption was clearer than ever, and the town's leaders were more desperate than they had ever been.
But what they didn't expect was just how much the people in power would go to stop them.
The closer Clara and Samuel got to the truth, the more they realized that this wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about survival.
After the confrontation at the warehouse, everything felt different.
Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step she took seemed to echo louder. Every conversation seemed to draw more attention. They had made powerful enemies, and those enemies were beginning to close in. Samuel, with his unshakable calm, remained focused.
"We have what we need, Clara. The mayor's words, the deals, everything. But we need to act quickly."
Clara nodded. The evidence they had was damning, enough to bring the town's leaders to justice.
They had the illegal deals, the bribes, the land grabs, and the corporate ties that had been hidden for years. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed to expose the truth to the whole town, to let everyone see what was really happening behind closed doors. Together, Clara and Samuel reached out to their allies.
Marcus, Evelyn, Thomas, and the others rallied behind them, each one playing a crucial role in getting the truth to the people. They knew that the town's leaders would do everything they could to suppress the information, to cover up their wrongdoings, but they also knew that the people deserved to know. The longer they waited, the more the corrupt officials would get away with it. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would gather all the evidence they had and release it to the public. They would expose the deals, the manipulation, and the lies. They had to move quickly before the mayor and his associates could make their next move. One evening, Clara stood in front of the small group they had assembled. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also a sense of purpose. They were about to take the biggest risk of their lives. "We're not just doing this for us," Clara said, her voice steady. "We're doing this for everyone in this town who's been lied to, for everyone who's been taken advantage of. This is our chance to make sure they can't get away with it anymore." Samuel, standing beside her, added, "We can't let fear control us. We've come too far to turn back now." It's time to let the truth speak for itself. They knew what they had to do. As the evening grew darker, they made their way to the town hall, where the mayor and his associates were preparing for a private meeting. They needed to be quick, but they also needed to be careful. The evidence they had was enough to bring everything crashing down, but they had to make sure it got into the right hands. Once inside, they carefully distributed copies of the documents to the townspeople who had gathered outside. The truth was about to be revealed, and there was no turning back. Clara felt a mixture of excitement and fear as the crowd began to gather, talking in hushed voices, their curiosity piqued. Samuel, his cane tapping softly on the ground, leaned in close to Clara. "It's happening," he said. "We've done it." Clara didn't answer right away. She was too focused on the growing crowd, on the people who were starting to piece together what had been hidden for so long. The first whispers of the truth began to spread through the crowd, and then, like wildfire, the anger started to rise. The townspeople had been kept in the dark for so long, and now they had answers. They had been lied to, taken advantage of, and manipulated. And they weren't going to stand for it any longer. As the night went on, the mayor and his associates were forced to confront the evidence. They tried to deny it, to cover it up with lies, but the truth was too powerful. The townspeople began to shout, demanding accountability. The mayor's face turned pale as the weight of his actions sank in. He had underestimated the power of the truth, the power of people who had nothing left to lose. Clara could hear the shouting from outside the town hall. It was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and determination. People were demanding change. They were demanding justice. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt hopeful. She had spent so much of her life feeling small, unnoticed, and unimportant. But now, with the truth on their side, she felt bigger than she ever had before. Inside the town hall, the mayor and his associates were scrambling. They knew they had no way out. The evidence was irrefutable. The deals they had made, the bribes they had taken, the lives they had ruined, all of it was laid bare for everyone to see. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. Clara stood beside Samuel as they watched the scene unfold.
The people they had been fighting for were finally getting their voices back.
The fear that had gripped the town for so long was beginning to lift. Samuel, though blind, could feel the shift in the air. The power had shifted from the hands of the corrupt to the hands of the people. It was a victory, but it was just the beginning. The mayor was escorted out of the town hall, his face red with anger and humiliation. He had tried to silence them, to suppress the truth, but in the end it was the truth that had silenced him. As he was led away, the townspeople erupted in applause, cheering for the justice they had fought so long for. But Clara and Samuel knew this was only the first step. The battle wasn't over yet. They had exposed the lies, but the real work was just beginning. The town needed to rebuild, to heal, and to ensure that this never happened again. They needed to put systems in place to make sure that power could never be abused like this again. In the days that followed, the town began to change. People who had once been silent now spoke up, demanding transparency and accountability from their leaders. The corrupt officials who had once held all the power were replaced by new leaders, people who truly cared about the town and its future. The people had taken back what was rightfully theirs, and they weren't going to let it slip away again. For Clara and Samuel, the victory was bittersweet. They had exposed the truth, but it had come at a cost. They had risked everything, and though they had won, they knew that the fight for justice was ongoing. There would always be people who tried to hide the truth, to manipulate others for their own gain. But as long as there were people like Clara and Samuel, people who refused to back down, the truth would always find its way to the surface.
As Clara stood in the middle of the town square, watching the people celebrate, she felt a deep sense of pride.
She had done something she never thought was possible. She had stood up to the system, to the lies, and she had helped bring about real change. And she wasn't done yet. There was still work to be done, still people who needed help, still injustices that needed to be righted. But for now, Clara knew one thing for certain. They had taken down a town built on lies, and in doing so, they had given the people their voices back. Together, they had made a difference.